My son's girlfriend asked about the lake property 4 times before I started keeping track. The first time, I thought nothing of it. We were sitting on the back deck of my cottage in the Okanagan, watching the sun go down over the water in that way it does in late August, all copper and rose, and she had leaned over her wine glass and said, casually, the way someone might ask about the weather, "This must be worth a fortune now, with the market the way it's been." My son Daniel had laughed and said something about BC real estate, and I had smiled and passed the cheese board and thought nothing more of it. The second time was in September, at Sunday dinner. She had wandered into Robert's old study while I was clearing the table, and when I found her standing there looking at his framed engineering certificates on the wall, she had turned to me with that warm, open smile she always wore and said, "Did your husband own this property outright, or was there a mortgage when he passed?" I told her it had been paid off years ago, and she nodded slowly, and I filed the question somewhere in the back of my mind under things I'd think about later. By the 4th time, I had stopped filing and started listening. My name is Margaret Thornton. Most people call me Maggie. I spent 31 years as a registered nurse at Kelowna General, the last 12 of them as charge nurse on the cardiac unit. And if that work taught me anything, it's this. People reveal what they want in the questions they ask, not the ones they answer. I learned to read the families who came in during a crisis, the ones who asked the nurses which doctor had the most authority, the ones who wanted to know about wills and power of attorney before the patient was even stable. I had seen it enough times to recognize the shape of it. Robert had been gone 3 years. A stroke, sudden and complete, in the driveway of the house we had shared for 34 years, on a Tuesday morning in November. He was 69. He had been reaching into the back seat for his briefcase, and by the time the paramedics arrived, there was nothing to be done. I had stood in the emergency department where I had spent my career, and a colleague who was also a friend had held my hands and told me, and I had understood the words, but my body had not believed them for a very long time after. Daniel was our only child. He was 33 now, and worked as an architect in Vancouver, and he had his father's dark eyes and my stubbornness in equal measure. He had brought Cassandra Verne home in February, 7 months before the night she stood in Robert's study, asking about property deeds. She was 30, pretty in a carefully assembled way, quick with a compliment, quick with a laugh. She taught yoga in Vancouver and had opinions about everything, and a way of touching Daniel's arm when she spoke that made him look at her like she was the only person in the room. I had liked her well enough in the beginning, but 31 years of nursing teaches you about the gap between what a person presents and what a person is, and by October, the gap around Cassandra was starting to feel like a very wide thing. She had asked about the mortgage the 2nd time. The 3rd time, we had been at a family dinner in Vancouver, and she had brought up Robert's engineering firm without any particular reason, asking how long he'd run it, whether he had partners, what kind of work they did. Infrastructure consulting, I had told her. Bridges, water systems, commercial developments across the interior of BC. He had spent 40 years building it. I had told her this with the kind of pride that only comes from having watched someone build something from nothing, but I had noticed the way her eyes sharpened slightly at the word commercial and then softened again before I could be sure of what I had seen. The 4th time, she had asked me directly about estate planning, not as a suggestion, not as concern. She had framed it as helpfulness, the way someone might offer to carry a heavy bag, and she had said that a friend of hers worked with seniors at a law firm in Vancouver and that it might be worth reviewing my arrangements now that I was on my own. Things get complicated when there's a lot of property involved, she had said, especially lakefront, especially in this market. I had thanked her. I had told her my affairs were in good order. I had gone home to the cottage and I had sat in Robert's chair in his study, and I had let myself feel the thing I had been pushing away since September, which was that something about Cassandra Verne was deeply wrong. I didn't want to be that woman. The suspicious mother, the possessive widow, the one who couldn't let her son move forward. Daniel was happy. Genuinely, visibly happy in a way I hadn't seen since before his father died, and I knew what it would cost me if I was wrong. But I also knew what the alternative cost, because I had watched it happen in hospital rooms more times than I could count. An elderly person whose affairs had been quietly rearranged by someone patient enough to wait and charming enough to be trusted. I called Patricia first. Patricia Osei had been my closest friend since nursing school and had spent the last 15 years as a family law solicitor in Kelowna. When I told her about the 4 questions, about the study and the dinner table and the deck, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Maggie, I want you to come to my office tomorrow morning." I sat across from Patricia the next day while she pulled up something on her computer and then turned the screen to face me. "Tell me about Robert's business," she said. I told her what I had told Cassandra, but more. About how Robert had started the firm in his mid-20s with a drafting table and a second-hand truck. How he had won his first major provincial contract in 1997, a water treatment facility in the southern interior, by outbidding 3 larger companies. How the firm had grown from 4 employees to 47. How he had sold it 2 years before his stroke for more than most people would guess. Patricia was making notes. Did he have competitors who didn't fare as well? I thought about that for a moment. There was a company, Ridgeline Engineering. They competed against us for contracts throughout the 90s and early 2000s. Robert beat them 3 or 4 times on major bids. The last one I remember was a highway project in 2004, a big one. After that, I don't know what happened to them. Patricia typed something. I watched her face. "Who owned Ridgeline?" she asked. "A man named Gerald Verne." Patricia stopped typing. The name sat between us in the quiet of her office like something that had been waiting to be said. She looked at me steadily and said, "Maggie, you need to hear what I found." Cassandra Verne's full name was Cassandra Ruth Verne. She was Gerald Verne's daughter. Ridgeline Engineering had declared bankruptcy in 2005, the year after losing the highway contract to Robert's firm. Gerald Verne had spent the following 4 years fighting creditors, losing the family home in Penticton, and dying of a heart attack in 2009. He was 54 years old. Cassandra had been 17. I sat in Patricia's office, and I felt the floor shift under my feet, in a way it hadn't since the hospital hallway in November 3 years ago. "She's been planning this," I said. It wasn't a question. Patricia reached across the desk and put her hand over mine. "I don't know how long. But what I can tell you is this. She isn't who she says she is to Daniel, and someone who is genuinely in love with your son doesn't spend 7 months asking about property deeds and estate arrangements." She paused. "There's more." Cassandra Verne had been engaged once before, a man named Thomas Hayward in Calgary, whose widowed father owned 3 commercial properties in the Beltline. The engagement had lasted 5 months before she disappeared. Thomas's father had paid a significant amount to make her go quietly, and Thomas had told almost no one because he was too ashamed. Patricia had a contact, a private investigator named Frank Delisle who had worked with her firm for years. She said he was thorough and discreet and that if there was more to find, he would find it. "What do I tell Daniel?" I asked. "Nothing yet," Patricia said. "Not until we have something he can't argue with." That was the hardest part. Watching my son come for Sunday dinners, watching him look at this woman with his father's dark eyes full of something I hadn't seen there in years, and saying nothing, carrying what I knew like a stone in my chest every time she smiled at me across the table and asked whether I had given any more thought to simplifying my financial arrangements. Frank spent 2 weeks. He came to the cottage on a Wednesday with a folder that he set on the kitchen table without ceremony and opened with the quiet efficiency of someone who had long since made his peace with the terrible things people did. Cassandra Verne had used a variation of the same approach 3 times. Thomas Hayward in Calgary, a woman in her 60s in Victoria whose son had been dating Cassandra for 6 months before the mother suffered what appeared to be a minor episode of confusion, and her son had asked her to temporarily sign over financial management to him and his girlfriend. That arrangement had lasted 11 months. The amount missing from the woman's accounts when she finally reached out to an elder abuse hotline was substantial. "She didn't disappear that time," Frank said. "She was asked to leave." The son didn't press charges because he blamed himself. I looked at the photographs in the folder. A woman who looked like me, older, sitting in a kitchen that looked like mine. Cassandra standing beside her with that smile. "What is she after specifically?" I asked, though I already understood the shape of it. "The cottage property is what she can see," Frank said. "Lakefront in the Okanagan right now, that's between $1 and $2 million, depending on the lot. But anyone who does the math on a 40-year engineering firm sold 2 years before probate knows there's more than a cottage. He closed the folder. Your husband built something significant. She knows that. She just doesn't know the specifics. Robert had sold the firm for $2.3 million. His investment accounts, managed carefully over decades, held another $1.8 million. The cottage itself had been assessed at $1.4 million. Between the RRSP that had rolled to me, his life insurance, and the original property, my total estate sat just above $5 million. I lived on my pension, and the firm's royalty agreements on 2 bridge designs still in use. I hadn't touched the investment accounts since his death. We had never lived like people with money. Robert drove trucks and wore the same winter coat for a decade. I bought clothes at the end of season sales, and we took one vacation every 2 years and thought ourselves lucky. Money changes families, Robert used to say. He'd seen it happen to his own brother, over a parcel of land outside Vernon. The moment people know you have it, they start reorganizing themselves around it. Better to be quiet about what you've built. Cassandra had found the cottage. She had found the property records and done the math on the visible pieces. But she didn't know about the investment accounts or the trust Patricia had helped me establish after Robert died, which protected Daniel's eventual inheritance from being accessed by any future spouse without his explicit legal instruction. She was working with incomplete information. But she was working. I called Patricia. I called Frank. I called my physician, Dr. Amina Qureshi, who had been my doctor for 12 years and whose mother had experienced financial elder abuse in her 70s. Amina had told me about it once over tea, and I had never forgotten the expression on her face. I told Amina what I had found, and she was silent for a long moment, and then she said, "She hasn't approached you yet about any medications or about your cognitive health, has she?" I told her about the estate planning suggestion, about the friend at the law firm. Amina exhaled slowly. "I want you to be very careful about what you eat and drink when she's around. I want you to call me if anything seems off. And Maggie, I want you to know that if anyone comes to me with questions about your mental capacity, I will be telling them the same thing I'm telling you now, which is that you are one of the sharpest people I have ever known." 2 days later, she called me back. Cassandra Verne had made an appointment at the clinic, not as a patient, but asking to speak with someone about a family member. She had described an elderly woman in her mid-60s, showing signs of memory difficulties and confusion. She had asked which medications were typically prescribed. She had asked about the process for obtaining power of attorney in British Columbia when a family member was no longer fully competent. The receptionist had noted the details and flagged them. Amina had reviewed the record and called me immediately. I sat down on the kitchen floor with my back against the cupboards the way I used to sit on the floor of the break room at 2 a.m. when a shift had been too hard, and I let myself understand completely what was being planned. Not just the money, not just the property. Cassandra Verne was going to make me disappear while I was still standing there. My son's engagement party was scheduled for the 14th of November. Daniel had proposed in October, a quiet evening at a restaurant in Vancouver, and called me afterward with a joy in his voice that had broken my heart 6 different ways. He wanted to celebrate at the cottage, where he had grown up, where his father had taught him to paddle a canoe and to drive a nail straight. 40 guests had been invited. Family from both sides, friends from Daniel's architecture firm, a few of my former colleagues from the hospital. I had 2 weeks. We met in Patricia's boardroom. Me, Patricia, Frank, and Amina. Patricia had contacted a colleague at the RCMP, a staff sergeant named Claire Moreau, who handled financial crimes out of the Kelowna detachment, and who had spent 8 years investigating elder abuse cases before moving to financial crimes. Claire arrived in civilian clothes with a quiet, methodical manner and a way of listening that reminded me of the best nurses I had worked with, the ones who heard what you weren't saying. Frank had installed cameras in the kitchen and living room of the cottage 2 weeks earlier, small and entirely invisible, positioned to cover the areas where Cassandra moved most freely when she visited. He monitored them remotely. By the end of the first week, he had footage of Cassandra standing alone in Robert's study for 9 minutes, while Daniel and I were outside, opening the filing cabinet where I kept household papers, photographing pages with her phone. Claire watched the footage and said, "That's enough for a search warrant on her phone and her home in Vancouver. But I want to give her the opportunity to do something more explicit before the party." She paused. If she tries to administer something here on camera, there's no argument, no room for a lawyer to call it a misunderstanding. We set it up for the Thursday before the party. I invited Cassandra for tea, just the two of us, a conversation about the engagement, about what kind of daughter-in-law she hoped to be, about family. She arrived carrying a box of bakery muffins and that warm, practiced smile, and I led her into the kitchen and made tea and excused myself after 5 minutes, saying I needed to check on something upstairs. I watched from my bedroom on the tablet Frank had given me. She waited 30 seconds. Then she moved to the counter and opened her bag and removed a small pill organizer and a butter knife, and she crushed something into the tea and stirred it and replaced everything in her bag and was sitting at the kitchen table looking at her phone by the time I came back downstairs. I sat across from her. I reached for the mug. She watched me with the focused attention of someone waiting for a specific result. My phone rang. "Patricia, on schedule." "I'm so sorry," I said, standing. "I need to take this. It's my solicitor." I watched her face as I said the word solicitor, a small tightening around the eyes. I walked to the hallway with the mug held in both hands, and when I was out of sight, I poured it down the bathroom sink and wrapped the mug in a hand towel exactly as Frank had instructed and set it on the shelf above the toilet. Chain of custody. His exact words. Amina's lab confirmed it within 24 hours. Lorazepam. 2 milligrams in a cup of tea, enough to cause significant sedation and confusion in someone my age. Enough, if documented repeatedly, to support a claim that I was no longer reliably competent. Daniel arrived at the cottage on Friday afternoon with no idea. He carried in boxes of party decorations and a bottle of the Okanagan wine his father had loved, and he hugged me in the kitchen, and I held on longer than usual, and he said, "You okay, Mum?" And I told him I was just happy to see him. I was also calculating how many hours remained before he would know everything. The morning of the party, I found him in his father's study before breakfast, standing at the window looking out at the lake the way Robert used to stand when he was thinking through a problem. He turned when I came in, and there was something in his face that made me stop. "Mum," he said, "I need to ask you something." He hesitated, and in the pause, I saw the cost of what he was carrying. "Has Cassandra said anything to you about your finances? About managing things for you? About your health?" I didn't move. "What happened?" He sat down in Robert's chair. "She asked me last week if I thought you were starting to show your age. If I had noticed any confusion or forgetfulness. She said she was worried about you and that we should think about who would be handling things if you ever couldn't." He looked at his hands. "She said it like she was concerned. Like she cared about you. And I keep thinking about how she always seems to know exactly what to say about everything. And I keep thinking about Dad's engineering files she looked at when you were outside that one time, and I don't know." He looked up. "I don't know what I'm looking at." I crossed the room and sat on the edge of the desk, and I told him everything. Not to protect him from it, but because he deserved to know who he was, which was his father's son, and his father's son deserved the truth. He sat very still while I told him about the questions and Patricia and Frank and the camera footage and the mug in the bathroom and Amina's lab results. He sat still while I told him about Gerald Verne and Ridgeline Engineering and the highway contract in 2004 and a 17-year-old girl watching her father lose everything. He sat still until I finished, and then he put his face in his hands and breathed carefully for a long moment. When he raised his head, his eyes were wet, but his jaw was set. "What do we do?" he asked. I told him. He was quiet. Then he said, "At the party. She needs to be somewhere she can't simply walk away and reappear 6 months later with a different name," I said. "And you need witnesses, so that you never doubt what you saw. So that if she ever comes near you again, you have 40 people who can tell you exactly who she is." He looked at the framed photo on Robert's desk. The three of us, at the lake, the summer Daniel turned 12. Robert's hand on my shoulder, Daniel grinning so hard his eyes had nearly disappeared. "Dad would have seen her coming," Daniel said. "Your father wasn't better at people than you," I said. "He just trusted the voice that told him something was wrong. That's all it takes." The party began at 4. The Okanagan light in November is low and gold, and it came through the windows of the cottage and lay across the floors and the faces of our guests like a kind of grace. 40 people with wine glasses and good coats, the warm noise of people who loved each other, and underneath it the thing that only Daniel and Patricia and Frank and Amina and Claire knew. Cassandra arrived in a green dress with her hair down and a hostess gift, a candle that smelled of cedar and cloves. She moved through the room the way she always did, sure of herself, gracious, touching Daniel's arm when she spoke to him. I watched her from across the room. I thought about Gerald Verne and the 2004 highway contract and a girl watching her family fall apart and deciding that grief was the same as permission. At 5:30, Daniel stood up and asked for everyone's attention. Cassandra smiled up at him from beside the fireplace, the picture of a woman about to become part of a family. "I want to say something," Daniel said, "about my mother." Cassandra's smile stayed exactly where it was. "My father built everything he had quietly. He didn't want people to know what he had because he believed that wealth was something you used to protect the people you loved, not something you put on display. My mother is the same. She spent 31 years caring for strangers, and she came home, and she cared for us, and when my father died, she held this whole family together by herself." He paused. The room was listening. 3 weeks ago, someone tried to steal from her. Not quickly, not violently, carefully and patiently over 7 months, using my trust and my love as the door. The room was very quiet now. Cassandra's smile was still there, but something beneath it had shifted, like a light changing behind a window. "Her name isn't Cassandra Verne the way she told me," Daniel said. "It is. But what she didn't tell me is that her father's company competed against my father's company for contracts for 20 years. And when my father won a major bid in 2004, her father's company didn't recover. He died 5 years later. She was 17. He looked directly at Cassandra. The room followed his gaze. "I understand that kind of grief," he said quietly. "I lost my father too. But this isn't grief. This is something else." Patricia stood from her chair near the window. "I'm Patricia Osei. I'm Maggie's solicitor. I've been working with a private investigator, a physician, and the RCMP for the past month, and what we've gathered constitutes a criminal case." She opened the portfolio on her lap. Video evidence of an unauthorized search of private financial documents, lab confirmation of lorazepam administered without consent into Maggie's beverage, documentation of 2 prior incidents in Calgary and Victoria following the same pattern. Cassandra stood up. Her voice was controlled, but the warmth had left it completely. "This is humiliating," she said. "Daniel, I don't know what your mother has told you, but I have never done anything." "You were at the clinic," Amina said from across the room. Calm and clear, the way she delivered difficult news. "You asked my staff about cognitive decline testing, about the legal threshold for incompetency in British Columbia, about lorazepam dosages." She didn't raise her voice. "I've been Maggie's physician for 12 years. She is not in cognitive decline. She has never been in cognitive decline. The only confusion in this situation belongs to you." Claire Moreau had been standing by the hallway door for the past hour, looking like any other guest. She moved forward now, and the room parted slightly, the way rooms do when someone carries authority. "Cassandra Verne," she said. "I'm Staff Sergeant Claire Moreau with the RCMP. I need to ask you to come with me." Cassandra looked around the room. 40 faces, some shocked, some grieving for Daniel, some already hardening with the specific anger people feel when someone has tried to harm someone they love. There was nowhere to walk to that wasn't a witness. She went without speaking. The green dress disappeared through the front door, with Claire's hand steady at her elbow, and then there was only the sound of the lake through the windows, and 40 people breathing the same air, and Daniel standing in the middle of the room with his hands open at his sides. I crossed the room and put my arms around my son. He held on the way he used to when he was small and frightened. His shoulders shook once and then he was still. "I'm sorry," he said into my shoulder. "I brought her here. I should have—" "You loved someone," I said. "That's not something to be sorry for." Later, when the guests had gone and the cottage was quiet, we sat in Robert's study with 2 cups of tea and the lights low. Daniel had Robert's photo on his knee. Outside, the lake was dark, and the mountains were darker, and the November stars were very sharp and cold above the valley. "Who else did she do this to?" Daniel asked. "A man in Calgary. A woman in Victoria." I curled my hands around my mug. The woman in Victoria didn't press charges. She was too ashamed because she had nearly signed everything over. Daniel looked at the photograph. "Dad's contract won fair and square." "I know. Ridgeline was already struggling before that. Frank showed you the records. I know. Her father's death wasn't Dad's fault. I know that too, I said, and I'm sorry for what she lost. I am, but grief doesn't give you the right to poison someone's mother. He was quiet for a moment. What happens now? She'll be charged. The Victoria woman has agreed to come forward now that there's hard evidence and other charges. It'll take time. And us? I looked at my son, 33 years old, his father's face, my stubbornness, and enough of his own goodness that he had stood up in front of 40 people and told the truth even when it cost him something he had loved. We're all right, I said. We've been through worse and we're still here. 4 months later, on a March afternoon when the Okanagan was just beginning to think about spring, I walked down to the dock with my coffee and stood watching the ice pull away from the edges of the lake. Daniel was in Vancouver. He had started seeing a counselor in January and had called me every Sunday since the party and had driven up twice to walk the property with me and talk about his father and sometimes just to sit in the cottage without talking at all. Cassandra was facing 3 charges. The Victoria case had added 2 more. Patricia was in regular contact with the Crown prosecutor and said the evidence was solid. Robert's coffee mug was still on his desk in the study. His blueprints still covered one wall. His reading glasses were still exactly where he had left them on the last morning of his life. I had stopped thinking of this as inability to move on and started thinking of it as honest record-keeping. He had been here. He had built something. That mattered. I had told Daniel about the full estate in January, the same way my husband had always said difficult things, simply and without drama. The investment accounts, the trust, the total sum of 4 decades of quiet work. Daniel had sat with it for a long time, and then he said he never drove a new truck, and I had laughed, because that was the thing that had struck him, and it was the right thing to be struck by. I thought about Gerald Verne and his daughter sometimes. I thought about a 17-year-old sitting with the knowledge that her father was gone and that someone else had won, and that the world had kept moving without apology. I understood the weight of that. I understood it the way you understand things that are true and also not enough to justify what comes after. The ice was cracking at the dock. Somewhere in the tree line across the water, a bird had returned early. I had spent 31 years in a hospital watching people hold on to things and watching people let things go and learning the difference between the two. What I knew now, standing at the edge of the water my husband had loved, was this. Robert had not taken anything from Gerald Verne. He had won a contract honestly and built a life honestly and died without knowing what his success had cost a family he never met. And I was not going to let his legacy be eaten from the inside by someone who had confused revenge with justice. The water moved. The bird called again. I finished my coffee and walked back up to the cottage, where his things still waited, and where Daniel would come on Sunday, and where the garden was beginning to show the first faint green of what had been planted in the fall, in trust that spring would come. It always does. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in it reminded you of someone you love or a question you've been afraid to ask, I hope you'll share it. The patterns Cassandra used are real. They happen in families across this country every year. The ones who survive them are usually the ones who trusted the voice that said something wasn't right before they had proof. Trust that voice. And if you're watching over someone who might be vulnerable, watch the questions they're being asked, not just the answers they're giving. That's where the truth lives. Subscribe if you'd like to hear more stories like this one. And in the comments, I'd love to know, did you see the warning signs from the beginning, or did she almost have you fooled?